Our next presentation is Rich Blake. Rich is one of our Northwest guys. He is one of the leaders of a ON30 modular group. He lives on Whidbey Island and works at the Naval Air Station there. And he's going to discuss with us how he modifies Bachmann locomotives to run on his and other railroads. So, Rich.
For the intro, like I said, I'm an ON30 modeler. I've been doing this since, I don't know, 2010 or so in ON30. Before that, I was an HO guy, but I spent 30 years in the Navy, so I didn't get to do a whole lot of modeling until the last 10, 15 years or so. I got attracted to ON30 just because it was bigger than HO, and there's a lot of cool locomotives that Bachmann had produced back, 10, 20 years ago, and that captured my interest. So this one, I consider myself kind of an intermediate modeler. And so this project here, I'm just going to talk about Climax that I modified. That was one of my first projects that I ever did with a locomotive. I mean, locomotive modifying and kit bashing or even scratch building, it's kind of a intense and intimidating part of the hobby, I think. So this was a good learning exercise. I mean, I'm not a super advanced modeler, but I use a few techniques that I learned back from doing some military plastic models and some automotive modeling even, and applied it to this Climax project. So the first thing, being in a modular group is, especially with ON30, Bachmann's like the only producer of, out of the box locomotives. So a lot of the locomotive, there's very limited amount of locomotives you can get. So the Climax, there's one. There's Shea, there's one. And some of the other locomotives, they all look kind of the same. There's a few differences that the manufacturer gives you with different stacks and things like that. But I really wanted to create something that was different and unique. Something that I could say, hey, that's my loco. So what I did is into some planning is look for a prototype that I could follow. One thing that's nice about ON30 today is that it's the accepted form of narrow gauge modeling. I think 20 years ago, ON30 was not looked upon very well amongst the narrow gauge community just because it really didn't follow any particular American prototype. But now I think we're all past that now, so it's just modeling now. So anyway, one of the areas that I've been interested in is down in the Southwest Washington coast, where back during World War I, there was a lot of logging down there to extract the spruce off the coast to build aircraft. And there was a lot of small logging railroads that cropped up around that area. And there was one narrow gauge railroad, the Bay Lumber Company, that was established down there. It's very, very foggy history. Only a couple pictures you can find on the internet from that company. But the one that I did find is this bottom left here, this Climax that they used down in that area off of Willapa Bay. I was like, well, that'd be a good subject for my Climax, except you can see by the loco they have here that it's missing the headlight, and it looks like it's probably second, third, or maybe fourth hand. But it did give me a little bit of inspiration to pursue something. So during my planning, I took a look around the internet and found this one. This is a Elk River logging, I believe. It's an East Coast locomotive, but it had some nice design cues that captured my interest. one thing about the Bachmann out of the box locomotive, it doesn't have sandboxes in the back. So here's some sandbox examples. This locomotive had a rear facing headlight on the cab, which I found interesting. One of the other things here, it had a hose wrapped around the forward sandbox, which I could use as a design cue. And then the pilot in the front of the locomotive had all kinds of junk and stuff on it, which I was like, well, that's a good opportunity to mimic some of that stuff. So, and this is just kind of a just some of the stages I went through in planning and just figuring out what I was going to do. I wrote all this stuff down ahead of, I'm not going to read it all to you, you can just look at it. I wrote all this stuff down ahead of time just to give me an idea and a kind of a workflow of what I was going to do to the locomotive. The locomotive I started with was DCC sound equipped, so I didn't have to worry about that really that much. And so all I needed to focus on was really just disassembly, doing the details and scratch building anything I needed to, and then putting the thing back together and painting it and weathering it. So one nice thing about the Owen 30 locomotives from Bachmann is they come with a nice detailed illustrated parts breakdown in their instructions. It gives you all the parts and pieces, even gives you the part numbers if you had to order those, if you break something, whatever. So it's nice illustration that shows you how everything goes together. So I very carefully disassembled the locomotive and broke it down into individual pieces that I could work with. Most of the fixtures and stuff like that, those are easily removed with a pair of tweezers. They're just kind of lightly glued in there. I mean, you can break stuff, but just be careful. Like I said, this was the first time I've done something like this, so it was very intimidating, you know, just jumping in and taking stuff apart on a brand new locomotive. And then one of the other things I did was I took some side shots of the boiler and the cab and some of the piece parts, and I put them in Photoshop. And what I did is I moved things around, accessories on the locomotive to see what they would look like. You know, going back to some of my other pictures that I had from prototype locomotives to kind of get an idea of, you know, what I needed to do to, you know, capture the type of locomotive I was looking for. So one of the things I did have to do was a different stack, and I needed to move it so that I could move the dynamo up forward. So this is a die-cast locomotive, so you can't, you know, you're not going to be able to solder stuff to it. And anything that has to be removed that's cast as part of that die casting has to be removed with a Dremel tool or some kind of machining. So I just use my Dremel tool to like for the stack, the molded portion of the stack, to take all that stuff off and move it where I needed to. And then on the back of the locomotive, I wanted to move that light to be a rear facing light on the top of the cab. The stock tender has a die cast platform for the rear light on the tender. So that had to be removed using the Dremel tool again. And then this is just some pictures relocating the rear light. So just this die cast cab, so I could drill holes in it, no problem. And then I used some TCS wiring with they have these little micro connectors that you can purchase. And I just simply glued the wire inside the cab along some of the seam lines so you can't see it, and was able to attach the light to the existing electronics with a connector. So if I ever had to take all this apart again, I could just disconnect the connector and take the cab off. The next thing was to work on the tender. So the kind of the prototype inspiration I was looking at there was a coal-fired locomotive, but mine was going to be wood-fired. So I needed to build fencing for the tender and those sandboxes. So the fencing I built with just some brass strips and styrene. I use, this is a piece of insulation foam, this flat, insulation foam like you use for, some folks use for the roadbed. We use it on our modules for roadbed, but it's nice and flat and you can stick pins in there and use it as a template to make stuff. And like I said, this is all die cast, so you can't really solder things to the material. So I had to epoxy all this stuff together, put some nut bolt washers on the stakes there for the fencing, and then once it's painted, it looks, you can't tell it's plastic and brass. Put some I think these are precision scale grab irons, put those on the back of the tender. And then for the sandboxes, I just took a couple pieces of styrene doweling material and glued those together, and then filled in the gap with modeling putty, and then sanded it down to make it look like an oval box, and used styrene on the top for the lid. The hinges and the straps, that's made from the foil you get off of wine bottles. So drink more wine, get some scratch building materials. It actually molds pretty well, and I just used, again, using epoxy to glue all this stuff together and stick it on the back of the tender. And once they're painted, I mean, they look pretty good. In this form right here, everything looks kind of raw, but once it's painted, it looks pretty good. And like I said, it's the first time I did stuff like this, so I was kind of just making things up as I went. For the first layer of paint, so I go through different stages with paint. So the base layer, basically kind of my primer. I used Tamiya acrylics on this model, just because I'm familiar with that paint. I've used it a lot on other projects, and it mixes really well. Using the Tamiya thinner, of course. You can use other types of thinner, but the Tamiya thinner works the best. And I have my own homebrew flat black and gray mix to give me an engine, a boiler black type of color. And then I used a gunmetal, acrylic gunmetal paint for the smoke box and the stack. And then there you can see the back end of the tender blends in really well now. And then for weathering on this, so this is a backwoods locomotive. My proto-fictional company, Bay Lumber Company, they don't have a whole lot of funding. So, they take care of their locomotives mechanically, but cosmetically, they just sit out in the woods. So this thing's going to have a little bit, maybe a little medium plus weathering on it. So I like to use oil paints to do some of this kind of weathering, just because it dries super flat, and it's fairly easy to work with to get interesting effects. This, I put a picture down here. This is most of the big, like, armor type modeling shops would have this Abtalung oil paint weathering kit. And then I went to the art store and I found this odorless terpenoid thinner to thin out my oil paints, which is nice. it is odorless, and it doesn't give you a headache. So it's really easy to work with. So what I do is on the area that I want to weather, I'll just put dots of different tones of that oil paint, and then blend it in with a thick, like a cat tongue brush, and that terpenoid stuff. And then this is like over here on the left side, just showing some of the effects that you can get with the oil paints. And I didn't want to go too far with it, but it's definitely looks like it's weathered. It's taken care of, but it's been sitting out in the woods for a while. So after the paint was done, most of the painting was done, then I got into building some accessories. I had some brass fittings that I stole from some of my car modeling stuff. Brass whistle. I got a bunch of little accessories here that are being painted. Got some dudes to stick in there. Always got to have dudes in your locos, or otherwise you can't. Nobody to drive it, right? So, and then got a steam pump. It's a white metal steam pump kit. I modified it with a couple of rods in there to make it look like actual shafts, and some piping stuff. And then took a piece of solder and bent that around to get that hose that I use as a inspiration from that prototype locomotive. So that's going to go around the steam dome. And then this wire right here is a single strand from a multi-strand piece of wire. So I got a picture of wire here down here. I've used that for making antennas and stuff on race cars and things. And so this is a lot better than the piece of thread that Bachmann originally had on there. And then I also put a Grant Line bell on it. And on the pilot, just some typical junk you'd find on a logging locomotive. And then there's a right side installing my dudes. And those guys I rubber cemented them in so I can take them out easily if I needed to do anything in here. And then left side here, you can see where I put the piece of solder around the sand dome. And I got a brass box here that's been painted and weathered. And then there's a view of the other side with all the other accessories and all the piping and everything back in place. This was fun putting stuff back together. It was very tedious, trying not to damage things or scratch the paint. So just, had to be really careful with stuff. And then a little bit more detailing. So chopped up some rhododendron branches to make real wood loads to put in there. Also during my tender mod, I had extended the water hatch from the original. So that's extended up because it's a wood-fired loco. So you need some extra space there to get water in the tender. For some of the chalk type weathering, I use these MIG pigments. These are similar to the I think they're called Bragdon powders. Same type of stuff. Is that this is more geared towards the armor type modelers. Works really well. And then on the right side is showing a pencil. This is a number 2, I think, or a HB piece of lead pencil that I'm using to as a highlighter to highlight some of the edges on metal objects. And I do that throughout the model to give it a little bit more of a highlight on the edges towards the tops of stuff. It actually works really well. And this is just a shot of the back of the locomotive after it's been weathered a bit. One thing that I forgot to do was put the tubes from my sandboxes down to the wheels. So one of these days I'll go back in there and fix that. And this is a side view looking on one of my modules. I also put a rain shade on the cab up there. That's just a piece of brass. Whoops. This is the other side. A little bit different lighting shot. This was at the narrow gauge convention in Pasadena, actually, when we had the humongous Owen 30 layout set up with, I think we had 5 different clubs all set up together from California, Texas, and Washington. That was a lot of fun. And this is one of my other locomotives right here. This is number 2 Shea. Not quite as extensively modified, but it's been weathered and kind of super detailed a little bit more, I guess, or maybe the same. This is one of my modules here with some other stuff on there. Got a donkey back there and a little critter. So my proto fiction. So the idea was that, I was going to recreate this, a Bay Lumber Company logging locomotive, but just a little bit newer, a little bit more functional, not quite as run down as this one. So I did some photoshopping, kind of made my own representation of that prototype photo. People sometimes, when they see us run these big old logs on the modules, it's like, man, those logs are way too big for that locomotive. And then I show them the prototype picture, like, okay, whatever. Logs used to be that big. And that's it. So here's some of the resources. I know you guys know about Keith Wiseman, great resource. Narrow Gauge Modeling Company, that's another place where I have found quite a few things. And just Bachmann, and of course, Narrow Gauge and Short Line Gazette, lots of inspiration in there. And questions?
Well, thank you. That was just absolutely brilliant. I've been really impressed as Jerry here, and I'm moderating questions for this presentation. I'm really impressed. It's very hard to believe this is the first time you've done something like this on a scale locomotive. That's just amazing work. And I think you've really captured that look at the prototype that you were after. So the only comment I've had here is Pete Smith commented on having what a great idea using a pencil for highlighting. It's once again, sometimes somebody comes from a different area of modeling and they bring ideas with them that model train guys haven't thought of, and it's really great to see that. So I really like that idea. I'll be using that. I'll be stealing that. Thank you. Robin Peel commented, lovely. Jim Brown sent a link to Amazon. Try these for weathering pencils. So if you look in the chat box, you'll find that link. Dan says, awesome. I like Owen 30. Mark Lewis says, incredible modeling using just, quote unquote, a Bachmann Owen 30 Climax. Yeah, I really like that model, and I think a lot of people do. I've got one myself and did a little bit of work on it. Banta actually makes some very interesting little add-on parts like wood cabs and things like that for the Bachmann locomotives. That'll look really cool. And if you can find them, Backwoods Miniatures did some in brass that were really nice.
Yeah.
Out of production now, of course, but it'd be lovely to see some of those again. So any other more questions for Rich? Oh, so Keith Stamper commented, I use Turpenoid and pan pastels for weathering my box cars. Turpenoid is a very versatile product and great for streaking. And as Rich pointed out, it's virtually odor-free. So it's a product you can use without, gassing yourself out of the house. And the rest of the family too.